AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Everyone, this is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have a very interesting guest who's actually both. His name is James Stejskal. He is an author, a military historian, and a conflict archaeologist. He spent 35 years in the U.S. Army Special Forces and the Central Intelligence Agency, serving in interesting places in Africa, Europe, the Balkans, in the Near and Far East. He's written a series of books called The Snake Eater Chronicles, and he has a brand new book out entitled Dead Hand. James, welcome to AFIO Now.
Great to be here. Glad to have been invited to talk with you.
James, what's the new book about?
Well, I thought I would try to do something contemporary, and so I picked on Vladimir Putin. It's sort of a conceptual novel about what would come next after Russia overruns Ukraine. And last year I was kind of optimistic about things, but this year not so much. So basically it's a book about, it's a spy thriller. It involves a couple of CIA case officers, older for some strange reason, being called out of retirement because one of them is the only one a certain Russian wants to talk to. And it involves a nuclear program that the Russians have had for several years and apparently have brought it out of mothballs. It's a program that basically scares the bejesus out of Washington, and so they have to find out what's going on. So two intrepid CIA agents, somewhat older, as I said, they get to go into Eastern Europe, primarily Lithuania, to find out what's happening. And it goes downhill from there.
Tell our audience about a few more of your characters.
Well, we've got one guy who is called Joshua Devlin. He's actually coming out of a separate line of adventures, but he's had to change his name because he was compromised a long time ago. So he is now in what I euphemistically call the CIA's Witness Protection Program. The Soviets and now the Russians have caught on to his games, and they don't like him very much. So he is paired up with another interesting character whose name is Gabriel. Gabriel comes from Mongolia originally, has worked with the Chinese triad gangs throughout the Far East, and then came to the United States and made it through Berkeley's Chinese language program. He's kind of a wizard with languages. At last count, he thinks he knows how to speak 23 languages fluently. I can think of a few guys that can actually do that. They are paired up with several interesting people at the headquarters of the CIA, but the other primary guy that's in the book is a Russian official who has been reporting to the agency for a very long time, but basically controls his own program. He does not take money from the agency. They have set up an account for him, but he really doesn't even bother to use it because he's so high up in the hierarchy, he doesn't need it. But this gentleman, whose code name is Hammer, does not like the current president of Russia. And he has been reporting to the agency for a long, long time. So these three guys are the primary characters in the book.
So I gather from your earlier comments that history of the last couple of years definitely influenced both the kind of the setting and the venue for the book.
It did very much so. We all like to think that the Cold War ended in about 1990, 1991, but unfortunately, the Russians never really saw it that way. The current regime in Russia is doing its best to reestablish Imperial Russia, basically, by expanding its borders. My take on it is if the current situation is not stopped in Ukraine, it won't it won't stop there. It will continue moving different places. Into the Baltics is one. That's the major premise of my book. The Russians' next move after taking Ukraine was to roll over Moldova and then to go into the Baltics. And if you look at the news from the last couple of days, I think you can see that we still have a major problem in the East. Congress in the United States may have made it much easier for the Russians to continue doing what they're doing. Unfortunately, it plays right into the theme of my book.
So there's actually quite a bit of very good tradecraft in the book. I assume that your own background helped you with some of those descriptions.
It did. When I was a young whippersnapper in the Army, was in 4.5 years before I was sent to Berlin to join what was then a classified special forces unit. We operated in Berlin in civilian clothing, and unlike most of the other special forces units, we had to employ intelligence tradecraft in our work. For training, the Army relied on a group of venerable men, which, looking back, are probably about how I look now, but they turned out to be annuitants from the CIA, and they called themselves Team 10. And they would come over several times a year, teach us everything from the proper way to drink our coffee to how to survive while under surveillance from a hostile intelligence service. That was my introduction. And throughout my career in the Army, I continued to do unusual things like that. And so I got quite a bit of training in that area. Then when I retired, another long story, but here I got a note that I should talk to somebody at a certain coffee shop in Virginia. And so I did. And shortly thereafter, I was hired by the CIA. So it's been essentially 31 years of this kind of fun stuff. And people say, thank you for your service. And I always say to them, you have no idea, so much fun. So anyway.
It sounds like our careers must have almost intersected a number of times. I enlisted in Army intelligence back in 1967 and 2 years undercover in Berlin, running cross-border operations into East Germany in the late 60s.
Well, that kind of rings a bell for some strange reason. That's actually, my Army career was really the starting point. And my writing of history was the starting point for my novels. And so my first novel actually takes place in Berlin. So I'm on book number 5 now. Dead Hand is number 4, and we're following some of the same people from approximately 1956 all the way up into the 80s, and we'll see where the series goes from here.
James, we've talked a little bit off camera about conflict archaeology, and I thought our audience would like to hear just a little bit more about that, how you got involved and what some of the things that you did.
Okay. It's kind of hard to explain, and then maybe it's not. Conflict archaeology is a very recent development in the field of archaeology, and it deals with more modern conflicts, probably from the 1850s. And it deals not only with what we know as battlefield archaeology, which is going out and looking at the terrain of the land and how the battles were fought, but it also looks at the social aspects of conflict and what motivated the people that were in the conflict or were affected by the conflict. It is a very interesting field, and it actually led me to write one of my histories, which was a history of Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, and what I saw as his contribution to the origins of British special operations. And that basically came from my research that I did in Jordan, looking at battlefield sites where Lawrence had fought, but then also looking at the reasons for why he was chose to fight. And I saw a nexus between his operations, between LMB, the Royal Navy, the Royal Flying Corps, and even the Royal Tank Corps, which led me to believe and then share my ideas on Lawrence as one of the creators of special operations and combined operations. And this was all due to his campaigns in what was known as the Hejaz, today Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria. So it's been quite enlightening, and it informs not only my history books, but it informs my novels as well.
My family and I have taken several overnight overland treks, and we actually drove along the old Hejaz Railway and visited a couple of the train wrecks that Lawrence was blowing up during reel one of the movie.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and very desolate landscape there, and I must have been on some of the same tracks that you were, because we visited where Lawrence did his first derailment and some of the other places that they fought, all centered on the Hejaz Railway, because it was a major line of communication for the enemy, for the Turkish troops that were occupying that area. So,
James, a subset of our audience is young people, both in high school and college, and a number of them are interested in a career in intelligence. Based on your background, what kind of advice would you give to young Americans who might be thinking about a career either in special forces or in intelligence?
I think probably one of the key things is to have as broad an experience in your education as you can. I know there are a lot of people that specialize in certain histories, certain languages. Those are all good, but it's important to have the broad depth of experience that you need to be able to be adaptable and flexible. One of the things I learned in the agency and even in the Army was to do your job, you need to work with other people. And that's especially true in the agency. You have to have people that are going to help you get the information that you want. But you also have to deal with people on a day-to-day basis. Whether you're in an embassy or in a business or in a military, you have to know how to deal with people and how to, it's probably the word that most people would not like to hear, but you have to be able to manipulate people to accomplish your goals. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but basically you're getting them to do what you need to be done and have them feel good about it. So there's just ways to do that. Read history, read current affairs, know what's happening in the world and why it's happening. And finally, I think very important also is to be curious about foreign lands and their peoples. Without that, you're not going to enjoy a career in the agency or in the Army.
Well said. Well, the book is called Dead Hand. It is a fast-paced, action-packed spy thriller. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I want to thank James for a fascinating interview.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate being here, and I'm hoping to get to the next AFIO meeting when it happens next year.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.